Across the Western world, we're all facing the same questions. Our nations differ in size and history, but the symptoms are shared. Communities losing a sense of story, institutions drifting without a vision, economies tied to distant powers, and citizens who no longer believe their voices matter. The problem is not that our civilization has failed, it's that we've forgotten we are one. Civilizationism begins where divisions end. It reminds us that the English-speaking world and the broader family of free nations it helped shape still share the same moral grammar, law before power, liberty balanced by duty, reason guided by faith and human dignity. The Western Confederation is a way to live that truth again, not as an empire or an ideology, but as cooperation between equals, a network of nations renewing what once made them strong: trust, continuity, and courage. Together, we can restore the West's coherence, not by looking backward, but by standing together in the present, building a future worthy of the civilization that brought us here. Civilizationism is the belief that the truest form of human cooperation is not global nor tribal, but civilizational. It begins with the understanding that a civilization is not a government, it's a living inheritance, a pattern of law, culture, heritage, and moral order that outlives any empire or ideology. In our case, that civilization is the West. A tapestry woven from Athens and Jerusalem, Rome and London, from Magna Carta to Westminster, for reason and revelation alike. For centuries, this civilizational language gave us a compass, liberty bound by responsibility, truth guided by law, and progress guided by principle. But we forget to speak it. Civilizationism is the decision to remember. It's a philosophy of renewal, to rebuild what works, to reconcile what's fractured, to choose stewardship over chaos. The Western Confederation embodies that philosophy. It's a voluntary fellowship of free nations, sovereign yet united by trust. Through cooperation in trade, education, and defense, the Confederation rebuilds civilizational coherence without coercion. Each nation retains its identity, yet each strengthens the whole. Together, we can shape a century defined not by decline, but by renewal, where the West does not fade quietly, but remembers itself and begins again. The Western Confederation is not a new idea. It is a natural evolution of one. Kanzuk laid the foundation: 4 nations with shared law, language, heritage, and institutions working together through free movement, trade, and defense cooperation. The Western Confederation simply takes those same principles, trust, consent, and continuity, and builds the whole framework around them. Where Kanzuk is an alliance of nations, the Western Confederation is a civilization of partnerships, regional councils, educational exchanges, cultural bridges, and coordinated policy networks, all designed to make cooperation natural rather than exceptional. Its strength is in structure. The Confederation does not seek a single government or bureaucracy, it seeks interoperability, systems that work together without losing their character. Each nation remains free, but never alone. The Western Confederation is simply Kanzuk taken to its logical conclusion. The same family of nations, joined by the same trust, expanding its reach and renewing its purpose for a changing world. It is the living form of civilizationism the West remembering that it is always strongest when it acted as one. Wherever the West faces existential pressure, it remembers its common language of order and liberty. From the defense of Europe against invading empires to the long alliances that defeated totalitarianism, our civilizations have always found unity when principle was tested. Through history, the nations of the West have always found each other again when the world seemed to close in, when empires rose to extinguish freedom, or when tyranny marched behind new banners. Our differences gave way to a deeper instinct, the defense of law, dignity, and conscience. We stood together at Vienna, at Trafalgar, at Normandy, and through the long vigil of the Cold War. Each time, the West did not unite for conquest, it united for survival, and from survival it rebuilt. Civilizationism begins where those alliances left off. It asks us not to wait for another crisis to remember who we are, but to build that unity deliberately, in peace. The Western Confederation is the vessel for that memory, a structure for cooperation before the storm, a promise that we can stand together by choice rather than by desperation, because the West's most significant victories were never just military, they were moral. They were moments when free peoples proved that their civilization still had the will to defend what was right. We have that choice again, not to fight another enemy, but to overcome forgetfulness, to remember the civilization that once stood for liberty, and to make it stand again. We do not seek to be feared for cruelty, but to be respected for resolve. A civilization that defends its people, keeps its promises, and lives by its laws will always be treated with caution by its enemies and with trust by its friends. Let the West be formidable again, not through conquest, but through clarity. Let those who would test us know that we have remembered who we are. A civilization that defends its freedom, its families, and its future with unshakable will. Respect will follow not from fear of our anger, but from awe of our unity. Across the long arc of history, the West has never been merely a geographical term. It has been a pattern, a cultural engine fed by ideas that outlived the empires that carried them. At its core, Western identity is rooted in ancestry, a shared ethnic and cultural lineage that has carried forward the civilizational pattern, while remaining open to adoption by those who carefully embrace its principles. This ancestral continuity provides the deep layer of trust and coherence that allow commitments to reason over dogma, conscience over coercion, and law over arbitrary power to endure across generations. Adoption strengthens the whole when it aligns with the foundation, but unchecked fragmentation dilutes it and risks eroding the very engine of renewal. This identity emerged from many sources: Greek devotion to inquiry, Roman mastery of law and statecraft, Christian moral revolution that elevated dignity and duty, medieval structures and institutions that held learning together, Renaissance rediscovery of potential, Enlightenment's insistence on liberty, and the industrial and democratic cultures that followed. Each layer built a civilization that continually renewed itself by self-criticism, innovation, and shared ideals. Civilizationism argues that this identity is not finished, and has never been. No civilization rises without shadows. The West has known conquest, exploitation, and arrogance, but it has also uniquely developed the mechanisms to correct itself. Abolitionist movements, representative institutions, rights-based discourse, scientific openness, civic reform traditions, and the capacity to publicly examine its own failings. This ability to confront wrongdoing and rebuild higher is itself a civilizational virtue. Civilizationism does not whitewash the past, nor does it wallow in guilt. It recognizes a simple truth. A civilization matures when it learns from its mistakes without surrendering its identity. A civilization's moral trajectory is defined not by the absence of errors, but by the presence of renewal. In the multipolar world taking shape, the West is not the world's ruler, nor should it seek to be, but it is the civilization whose foundational assumptions, rule of law, individual dignity, scientific inquiry, open debate, enable human flourishing on a scale unparalleled in history. This is not supremacy, it's functional advantage. Civilizationism suggests that the West's role is not to dominate, but to provide a stable model of civic cooperation, a framework for accountable institutions, an ecosystem where innovation thrives, and a moral grammar that respects the human person. Wherever these ideas spread through peaceful adoption, they raise living standards, strengthen communities, and empower individuals. As humanity moves into an age defined by AI, biotechnology, automation, and planetary interconnectedness, the question becomes, which civilization has the institutions and values best suited to steward these forces responsibly? Civilizationism argues that the West is uniquely positioned for this role because it balances freedom with restraint, ambition with accountability, innovation with ethics, power with moral reflection. But this leadership is not automatic. It must be earned. Through unity, cooperation, and self-renewal, Western nations can act as a stabilizing core around which a healthier global system can form. Not an empire, nor a dominator, but a pillar, a civilization that strengthens other civilizations by example, not by imposition. If the West were merely a political bloc, it would not be worth defending. If it were merely an economic zone, it would not inspire loyalty. If it were merely a cultural inheritance, it would lack purpose. But the West is something more profound, a worldview that insists human beings are capable of rising above fear, chaos, and tribal collapse through cooperation, creativity, and shared purpose. Civilizationism invites Western peoples to recover this confidence, not as nostalgia, but as orientation, not as domination, but as contribution. The future is not guaranteed, but a restored, principled, confident West can offer humanity something precious: the possibility of a world shaped by wisdom, liberty, and mutual uplift, rather than by coercion or despair. Civilizationism confronts a reality often evaded. Ethnic and ancestral continuity among majority populations has historically been the bedrock of high-trust Western societies. It fosters uniform norms, reciprocity, and a shared understanding that enable institutions of law, inquiry, and self-correction to function effectively. In the nations of the Anglosphere and broader West, this shared ancestral heritage, tracing back to European roots, shaped by Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, and the Germanic traditions, creates natural interoperability without coercion. The Western Confederation builds on this existing foundation, prioritizing alignment among peoples with deep ancestral ties to sustain civilizational coherence. This is not exclusion for its own sake, nor supremacy. It is stewardship of what works, preserving demographic stability to guard against the fragmentation that turns universal principles into self-negation. Other civilizations maintain their own ancestral coherences. The West must reclaim its own to offer humanity a proven model of responsible flourishing. It is precisely because the West developed such a powerful moral identity that it now faces an unusual vulnerability. These same universal principles that once gave Western civilization confidence and coherence have, in their modern unbounded form, begun to erode the very civilizational framework that sustained them. To understand why renewal is now necessary, we must first examine how moral universalism, detached from civilizational self-recognition, became a source of fragmentation rather than strength. Western civilization's commitment to moral universalism, one of its greatest historical strengths, has, when taken beyond its original scope, produced an internal fragmentation of identity. This is civilizational peers have largely avoided. This vulnerability is amplified by Occidentalist frameworks that reframe Western norms as uniquely illegitimate when exempting non-Western civilizations from equivalent scrutiny. Occidentalism refers to a set of intellectual and cultural narratives that portray the West as uniquely oppressive or predatory, spiritually hollow or morally bankrupt, historically illegitimate as a civilizational actor. Unlike critique grounded in comparative civilizational analysis, Occidentalism operates by flattening internal Western diversity, attributing moral agency asymmetrically, and treating Western universalist claims as evidence of domination rather than ethical aspiration. This is not criticism of Western actions, but criticism of Western existence as a normative reference point. Western societies historically advanced universalism in bounded forms. Roman law universalism applied within citizenship structures. Christian moral universalism coexisted with civilizational distinction. The Enlightenment's universal rights were embedded in national polities. In the modern period, universalism has been detached from civilizational boundaries, producing three effects. 1. Moral asymmetry. Western societies hold themselves to universal standards while tolerating particularism elsewhere. 2. Identity dilution. Civilizational continuity is treated as exclusionary rather than preservative. 3. Normative paralysis. Any assertion of Western distinctiveness is framed as moral regression. It is not universalism as ethics, but universalism as self-negation. Most civilizations balance internal moral codes with external civilizational self-interest. By contrast, Western civilization increasingly externalizes moral authority, internalizes collective guilt, and treats its own continuity as morally suspect. The result is not pluralism, but unilateral disarmament at the level of identity. The problem then is not that Western civilization developed universal moral principles, but that it abandoned the civilizational structures that once gave those principles coherence, reciprocity, and durability. The West has always lived with internal tension. Its history is shaped by productive dualities, faith and reason, liberty and order, individual conscience and collective responsibility. These tensions were not signs of weakness, they were the engine of renewal. What has changed is not the presence of division, but the absence of a shared civilizational frame capable of containing it. In the absence of civilizational self-recognition, internal debate hardens into fragmentation. Political differences cease to be arguments within a shared inheritance and become competing narratives about the civilization's legitimacy itself. When a society no longer agrees on what it is, it loses the capacity to decide what it owes, its past or its future. Civilizations are rarely destroyed in a single moment. They erode through incoherence, loss of confidence, and the gradual replacement of shared meaning with isolated fragments. Civilizationism begins with the recognition that coherence must be deliberately restored or will not be restored at all. If the West is to recover its coherence, the answer is not to abandon universal principles, but to re-anchor them in truth, reciprocity, and civilizational responsibility. Universalism without wisdom dissolves into abstraction. Morality without truth becomes self-negation. It is here that civilizationism returns to its deepest foundation, not power, not guilt, but the disciplined pursuit of truth and wisdom that once allowed Western societies to renew themselves without losing who they are. If civilizationism has a moral core, it is this. Truth and wisdom are the highest goods a civilization can pursue. Empires can rise on power, nations can endure on loyalty, but civilizations survive on their relationship to truth. Throughout Western history, the societies that thrived were those that nurtured truth seekers, built institutions to preserve knowledge, and elevated wisdom above propaganda, faction, and transient passion. From the philosophers of Athens to the monastic scribes of Lindisfarne to the natural scientists of the Enlightenment to the thinkers and innovators of the Anglosphere, the West's defining trait has never been geography or imperial borders. Its defining trait has been a persistent, almost sacred conviction that reality matters, that truth can be known, and that wisdom is worth pursuing, even at high cost. Civilizationism recognizes that truth is not a political instrument. It is a civilizational compass. Without it, societies drift, and when societies abandon wisdom, they collapse. Today, we face a crisis of truth unlike anything in our history. Information is abundant, but wisdom is scarce. Opinions multiply, but understanding shrinks. People live inside echo chambers, each with their own curated realities, disconnected from the shared foundations that make cooperation possible. Civilizationism argues that the West must reclaim cultural literacy, intellectual honesty, and a shared reverence for wisdom, if it is to lead humanity into the next age. It is not enough to be technologically advanced. It is not enough to be materially wealthy. It is not enough to be militarily strong. A civilization survives not by force, but by coherence. And coherence comes when a people are anchored in truth. Thus, the Western mission, if it is to have one, is not to dominate the world, but to reintroduce wisdom into a chaotic age, to rebuild institutions that prioritize reality over ideology, to defend free inquiry and scientific integrity, to cultivate a population capable of discerning complexity, not just consuming simplicity, to elevate dialogue, debate, and the shared search for understanding, to champion honesty, humility, and intellectual courage. Civilizationism holds that truth is not merely a philosophical ideal. It is a strategic asset. A society that can see clearly can navigate crises, innovate responsibly, and build sustainably. And wisdom earned through struggle, tradition, and reflection is what ensures that power is used justly, that prosperity is not squandered, and that freedom does not decay into chaos. In this sense, a revitalized Western Confederation, Kanzuk, or a broader Anglosphere-led framework would not simply be an economic or strategic bloc. It would be a custodian of truth-seeking traditions, inheriting the legacy of the universities, the courts, the scientific method, the press, and the democratic forum. The future will belong to cultures that can remain rooted in reality. Civilizationism proposes that the West, if united, purposeful, and honest, can again become the world's lighthouse of truth and wisdom, not as rulers, nor as conquerors, but as guardians of the human search for meaning. Civilizations do not endure on belief alone. They endure when belief takes form through institutions, habits, and structures that outlast any single generation. Civilizationism is not an ideology to be imposed, nor a movement to be rallied overnight. It is a framework, a way of organizing cooperation so that shared values can survive changing politics, technologies, and demographics. The Western Confederation exists at this level of structure. It is the recognition that the West's strength has never come from centralization, but from interoperability. Distinct nations, regions, and peoples capable of working together because they trust the same rules, speak a common civic language, and respect the same limits on power. Where past alliances were reactive, the Confederation is deliberate. Where empires ruled through hierarchy, it coordinates through consent. Where global systems dissolve identity, it preserves it. This is why Kanzuk matters, not as an endpoint, but as a prototype. It demonstrates that deep cooperation is possible without surrendering sovereignty, that free movement can coexist with national dignity, and that shared institutions need not erase local character. Civilizationism, applied through the Western Confederation, asks a different question than modern politics usually does. Not who governs whom, but how do free societies govern together? The answer is not isolation nor domination, but structured fellowship. Councils instead of commands, compacts instead of coercion, coordination instead of uniformity. Critics may charge exclusion or block politics, fearing a retreat into ancestral purity, yet the Confederation is grounded in an inherited reality, the ancestral sameness that already binds these nations in trust, language, law, and moral grammar. This ethnic continuity in essentials streamlines cooperation and preserves identity without demanding total homogeneity or barring those who assimilate fully. It equips the West to renew itself from strength, engaging the multipolar world order, not from apology or insecurity, but out of coherent resolve. In this model, nations remain accountable to their people, while civilization remains accountable to history. And that is the deeper purpose of the Western Confederation. Not to resurrect the past, not to compete for supremacy, but to ensure that civilization, which pioneered law, liberty, and self-correction, does not dissolve through neglect. Civilizationism is the discipline of remembering what works and building institutions worthy of carrying it forward. The work ahead is silent, patient, and generational, but it is how civilizations survive. Slogans do not save civilizations. They are preserved by people willing to take responsibility for what they inherit. Every generation receives a world shaped by those who came before it. The question is not whether that inheritance is perfect. None ever is, but whether it is worth carrying forward. Civilizationism begins with a simple act of honesty. To say that some traditions are worth preserving, some institutions are worth repairing, and some ideas are too important to be abandoned, including the ancestral continuity that has sustained our civilization's inheritance. The Western Confederation is not a promise of greatness. It is a commitment to stewardship, to tend the structures that allow free people to reason together, to govern themselves, and to pass on something better than what they found. This does not belong to any one leader, nation, or moment. It belongs to those who understand that civilizations endure only when ordinary people choose to uphold extraordinary principles. The future will not remember our arguments. It will remember what we preserved, and we will not leave that responsibility to posterity, nor allow it to decay into entropy.